She had nothing, just a suitcase and a question. "Can I clean your home for a place to stay?" When she knocked on his door, she had no idea how much that moment would change both their lives forever. What happened next will surprise you. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The harsh winter wind whipped across the Montana plains as Eleanor Mitchell clutched her worn coat tighter around her slender frame. At 32, life had dealt her more than her fair share of hardships. The small suitcase in her hand contained all she had left in the world after the bank foreclosed on her family home in Kansas City following her father's death. The stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of Silver Creek, a small ranching town nestled between rolling hills and pine forests. As she trudged down the muddy main street, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders. "Excuse me," she approached an elderly man sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store. "I'm looking for work. Do you know of anyone hiring?" The man looked her up and down, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Not much call for city folk around these parts, miss." "What skills you got?" Eleanor straightened her back. "I can cook, clean, sew. I managed my father's household for years." The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there's the Thornton Ranch about 3 miles north. Heard the owner's been keeping to himself since his wife passed. Place could probably use a woman's touch." He paused. "But I'd be careful heading out there alone. James Thornton ain't much for company these days." Eleanor nodded her thanks and continued down the street. The local boarding house wanted payment in advance money she didn't have. As the afternoon wore on, her options dwindled along with the daylight. With determination born of desperation, Eleanor set out toward the Thornton Ranch. The walk was longer than expected, and dusk was settling by the time the ranch house came into view. Substantial 2-story home with a wide porch, flanked by a barn and several outbuildings. As she approached, she noticed the peeling paint and unkempt yard signs of neglect that spoke volumes about the owner's state of mind. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the porch steps and knocked firmly on the door. Several moments passed before heavy footsteps approached. The door swung open to reveal a tall man with broad shoulders and a full beard. James Thornton's piercing blue eyes widened with surprise at the sight of her. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep and rough, as if unused to speaking. Eleanor summoned her courage. "Mr. Thornton, my name is Eleanor Mitchell. I understand you might be in need of household help." She met his gaze directly. "I can clean your home in exchange for a place to stay." James Thornton stood frozen, unable to respond. It had been 3 years since Margaret died. 3 years since he'd allowed anyone into his home. This woman on his doorstep with her determined eyes and city clothes was the last thing he expected. "I don't need any help," he finally managed, moving to close the door. "Please," Eleanor said quickly, placing her hand on the doorframe. "Just for tonight. I can't afford the boarding house, and it's getting dark. I'll be gone by morning if you wish." James glanced beyond her to the darkening landscape, then at the small suitcase by her feet. Something in her dignified desperation reminded him of himself after the war adrift and alone. "One night," he conceded gruffly. "The spare room upstairs, first door on the right." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. I'll earn my keep, I promise." As she stepped inside, James couldn't tear his eyes away from her. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was, despite her travel-worn appearance, but there was something in the way she carried herself that stirred something long dormant within him. "The kitchen's through there," he said, gesturing awkwardly. "Help yourself to whatever you can find. I'll be in the barn." Before she could respond, he grabbed his coat and strode out, needing distance from the unexpected emotions her presence had triggered. In the barn, James leaned against his favorite horse's stall, trying to calm his racing heart. "What was I thinking, Samson?" he murmured to the chestnut stallion. "Letting a stranger into the house?" When James finally returned to the house hours later, he was greeted by the forgotten aroma of home cooking. The kitchen table was set for one, and Eleanor was scrubbing at years of neglected dishes. "I hope you don't mind," she said, turning at his entrance. "I found some beans and bacon in the pantry." James stared at the simple meal, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. "You didn't have to do this." "It's the least I can do for your kindness," she replied simply. "Please, eat while it's hot." As James sat down to the first home-cooked meal he'd had in years, Eleanor continued working, giving him space. Neither realized that this night would be the beginning of something neither had dared hope for a second chance. Morning light filtered through the dusty curtains of the spare bedroom as Eleanor woke with a start. For a moment, she was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering the events of the previous day. She had promised to be gone by morning, but as she looked around at the neglected room and recalled the state of the rest of the house, she found herself reluctant to leave. Downstairs, she found James already dressed in work clothes, awkwardly attempting to make coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," she said, causing him to turn abruptly. "Miss Mitchell," he nodded stiffly. "I trust you slept well." "I did, thank you." She hesitated, then pressed forward. "Mr. Thornton, I'd like to propose an arrangement." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, waiting. "I need a place to stay until I can save enough for passage to California, where my aunt lives," Eleanor explained. "Your home needs attention that you clearly don't have time for, with all the ranch work. I'm proposing to stay on as your housekeeper, room and board, plus a small wage when you can manage it." James frowned, conflicted. Having her here stirred up memories and feelings he'd worked hard to bury. Yet the house had indeed fallen into disrepair, and the thought of returning to hot meals after long days of work was undeniably appealing. "I don't socialize much," he said gruffly, "and I'm used to my privacy." Eleanor nodded. "I understand and respect that. I won't be a bother. I'll keep to myself when you prefer solitude." After a long moment, James gave a single nod. 2 weeks. "We'll see how it goes." Relief washed over Eleanor. "Thank you. You won't regret it." "The ranch hand's bunkhouse is out back," James continued. 4 men work the property with me. They take meals at the cookhouse, but sometimes on Sundays, they used to." He trailed off, memories of happier times when Margaret would invite the men for Sunday dinner clouding his thoughts. "Perhaps we could revive that tradition," Eleanor suggested gently. "It would be good for morale, I imagine." James cleared his throat. "Perhaps. I'll be out with the herd today. There's a lean-to that needs fixing before the next storm." As he headed for the door, Eleanor called after him, "Mr. Thornton, is there anything particular you'd like for supper?" He paused, one hand on the doorknob. It had been so long since anyone had asked him such a simple, domestic question. "Whatever you fix will be fine," he answered, his voice rougher than he intended. The days fell into a rhythm. Eleanor rose early, preparing James's breakfast and packing his lunch before turning her attention to the mammoth task of restoring order to the once beautiful home. She worked methodically, room by room, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and airing out linens that had been closed up for too long. In the evenings, James would return to find a hot meal waiting and a bit more of his house reclaimed from dust and neglect. Their conversations were brief, at first mostly practical exchanges about household matters, but gradually lengthened as mutual respect grew between them. A week into her stay, Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing stew when James returned earlier than usual. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thornton?" "James," he said quietly. "My name is James." Eleanor smiled. "James," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her lips. "I'm Eleanor." "Eleanor," he nodded. "I finished the fence repairs sooner than expected. Thought I might." He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. "Help?" she offered. He nodded, looking almost bashful beneath his beard. "If you'd like." Eleanor handed him a knife and some carrots. "These need chopping." As they worked side by side, Eleanor sensed there was something he wanted to say. She waited patiently, humming softly as she stirred the pot. "The men were asking," he finally began, focusing intently on the carrots, "if you might be willing to cook Sunday dinner for everyone this weekend." Eleanor paused her stirring. "I'd be happy to," she said, warmth spreading through her chest at this small sign of acceptance. James glanced up, meeting her eyes briefly before looking away. They'll be pleased to hear it. That Sunday, Eleanor rose before dawn to prepare. She baked bread, roasted a chicken with herbs from the small kitchen garden she'd begun to revive, and prepared an apple pie with fruit from the orchard behind the house. When the ranch hands arrived, 4 men ranging in age from a young boy of perhaps 17 to a weathered man in his 60s, they removed their hats and shifted, awkwardly in the dining room that hadn't been used for company in years. "Ma'am," the oldest one, who introduced himself as Henry, nodded respectfully. "It's mighty kind of you to do this," Eleanor smiled. "It's my pleasure. Please sit, everything's ready." The meal began with awkward silence, but soon the men were talking and even laughing, sharing stories of the week's work. Eleanor watched James from the corner of her eye, noticing how he seemed both uncomfortable and relieved to have life returning to his home. After the meal, as the men were leaving, Henry hung back. "Miss Eleanor," he said quietly, "it's good to see the boss coming back to life a bit. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and followed the others out. That evening, as Eleanor washed the dishes, James appeared beside her with a towel, silently offering to dry. They worked in companionable silence until he spoke. "You've brought something back to this place," he said, his voice low. "Something I thought was gone for good." Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest but kept her tone light. "Just a bit of polish and good food. Any housekeeper could do the same." James shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not just any housekeeper." His blue eyes met hers, intense and vulnerable. "The 2 weeks are up tomorrow." Eleanor's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Yes, I suppose they are. I'd like you to stay," he said, "if you're willing." Eleanor smiled, hope blooming within her. "I'm willing, James. I'm very willing indeed." As winter deepened its hold on the Montana landscape, the relationship between Eleanor and James evolved with each passing day. 2 months had passed since she first appeared on his doorstep, and the Thornton Ranch had undergone a transformation, not just in its physical appearance, but in its spirit. The house now gleamed with polished wood and spotless windows. Curtains that Eleanor had mended fluttered in rooms that no longer smelled of dust and abandonment. The kitchen garden, though dormant under a blanket of snow, had been prepared for spring planting. Most significant, however, was the change in James himself. His beard was now neatly trimmed, his clothes mended and clean. He spoke more freely, not just to Eleanor, but to his ranch hands as well. The Sunday dinners had become a cherished tradition, filling the once silent house with conversation and laughter. One crisp December morning, Eleanor was hanging freshly washed sheets to dry by the kitchen stove when James entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Storm's brewing," he announced, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Henry thinks it'll hit by nightfall. I've sent the boys to bring the herd closer to the homestead." Eleanor handed him a cup of hot coffee. "Will it be a bad one?" "Could be," he nodded, accepting the cup gratefully, his fingers brushing against hers. "First big snow of the season often is." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I need to ride into town for supplies before it hits. Would you like to come along?" The invitation surprised Eleanor. In all her time at the ranch, she had not returned to Silver Creek. James had brought back necessities when needed, but they had existed in their own private world on the ranch. "I'd like that very much," she smiled. An hour later, they set out in James's wagon, bundled against the cold. Eleanor sat close beside him on the bench seat, acutely aware of his solid presence as he handled the reins with confidence. The town appeared much more welcoming than it had on her arrival. Christmas decorations adorned the storefronts, and townsfolk hurried about their business, preparing for the coming storm. As James secured the wagon outside the general store, Eleanor noticed people watching them curiously. When they entered the store together, conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with increased fervor. "Mr. Thornton," the shopkeeper greeted with evident surprise. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Mr. Peterson," James nodded. "We need supplies before the storm." He handed over a list that Eleanor had prepared. As Mr. Peterson gathered their items, a well-dressed woman approached, her eyes fixed assessingly on Eleanor. "James Thornton," she said. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your companion?" James stiffened slightly. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Eleanor Mitchell, my housekeeper." "Eleanor, this is Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife." Mrs. Holloway's smile didn't reach her eyes. "A housekeeper? How practical of you." She turned to Eleanor. "And where are you from, dear?" "Kansas City, originally," Eleanor replied politely. "I see. And you came all this way to keep house for a bachelor rancher?" The insinuation in her tone was unmistakable. Before Eleanor could respond, James stepped forward. "Miss Mitchell is an employee who deserves respect, Martha. Her presence has been invaluable to my ranch." Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure it has." She glanced between them. "Well, you must both come to the Christmas social at the church next week. The whole town will be there." With that, she swept out of the store. James's jaw was tight as they loaded their supplies. "I apologize for Martha Holloway," he said as they headed back to the ranch, the sky darkening ominously above them. "She's always been too interested in other people's business." "There's no need to apologize," Eleanor assured him. "I understand how it might look to others. A single woman living on a ranch with a widower." James's hands tightened on the reins. "What others think doesn't matter to me." "Nor to me," Eleanor said softly. "But perhaps we should attend the social. Show the town that there's nothing improper about our arrangement." James was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you want? To show everyone there's nothing between us?" The question hung in the air, weighted with unspoken feelings. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "I want whatever would make things easier for you, James. This is your home, your community. And if I said I didn't care what they think, that what matters to me is ... He trailed off as the first snowflakes began to fall. "Is what?" Eleanor prompted gently. James pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "What matters to me is what you think, how you feel. Being around you these past months has brought me back to life, Eleanor. I haven't felt this way since before Margaret died, and even then, it was different." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Different how?" "With Margaret, we grew up together. Our marriage was expected, comfortable." His blue eyes were intense as they searched hers. "With you, everything feels new, unexpected, like a gift I never thought I'd receive." The snow was falling more heavily now, but neither noticed. Eleanor reached out, placing her hand over his. "I feel the same way, James. I came here with nothing, looking only for temporary shelter. I never expected to find a home." "To find ... double quotes." She hesitated, then finished softly. "To find you." James's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "I don't want you as my housekeeper, Eleanor. I want..." His words were cut short by a sudden gust of wind that rocked the wagon. Looking up, they realized the storm had arrived in full force, much earlier than anticipated. "We need to get back," James said urgently, taking up the reins again. "This is turning bad fast." The journey home became treacherous as visibility decreased and the wind howled around them. By the time the ranch house came into view, they could barely see 10 feet ahead. "The horses!" James shouted over the wind as they pulled up to the barn. "Help me get them inside." Together, they worked frantically to unharness the team and lead them into the warmth of the barn. The other animals were already secured, thanks to the foresight of the ranch hands. "The men must have headed to the bunkhouse," James said, securing the barn door against the storm. "We need to make a run for the house." He took Eleanor's hand and they pushed through the blinding snow toward the porch. Once inside, they leaned against the closed door, catching their breath, clothes covered in snow and faces flushed from cold and exertion. As the howling wind rattled the windows, James turned to Eleanor, his expression resolute. "What I was trying to say before," he began, taking her hands in his, "is that I don't want you as my housekeeper. I want you as my wife." Eleanor's breath caught. James ... "I know it's sudden," he continued earnestly. "And if you need time, Or if your plans to go to California are still what you want, I'll understand. But I love you, Eleanor Mitchell. I never expected to love anyone again, but here you are, and I can't imagine this house my life without you in it." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as joy spread through her chest. "I love you too, James. I have for weeks now. And yes, I'll be your wife." As the blizzard raged outside, James pulled Eleanor into his arms, sealing their promise with a tender kiss, the first of many to come. Spring arrived in Montana with a burst of green that transformed the landscape. The snow-covered pastures gave way to lush grass, and the trees around the Thornton Ranch budded with new life. In the kitchen garden, Eleanor's carefully planted seeds were pushing through the rich soil, promising summer vegetables and herbs. Inside the ranch house, preparations for a wedding were underway. What had begun as a simple arrangement shelter in exchange for housekeeping had blossomed into a love neither Eleanor nor James had expected to find. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild. Eleanor stood by the bedroom window, watching as ranch hands and townsfolk arrived, setting up tables and chairs in the yard. The winter had been long and challenging, with blizzards that tested the ranch's resources and James's leadership. But they had weathered it together, their bond strengthening through each hardship. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Eleanor?" It was Henry's wife, Sarah, who had become a dear friend over the past months. "May I come in?" "Of course," Eleanor smiled, opening the door. Sarah entered carrying a small wooden box. "I've brought something for you, a tradition in these parts." She opened the box to reveal a delicate silver hairpin. "My grandmother wore this at her wedding, and her mother before her. It's said to bring blessing to a marriage born of true affection rather than convenience." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes as Sarah carefully placed the pin in her upswept hair. "Thank you," she whispered, embracing the older woman. "You've brought our James back to us," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "After Margaret died, we feared he was lost to grief forever. You're a blessing to this ranch, to all of us." Downstairs, James paced nervously in his best suit, freshly trimmed beard accentuating his strong jawline. The house was filled with the scent of roasting meat and baking pies, a feast prepared by the women of Silver Creek, who had gradually warmed to Eleanor once they witnessed the positive change in the once reclusive rancher. Even Mrs. Holloway had come around, arriving early with a hand-embroidered tablecloth as a wedding gift. "Every respectable household needs fine linens," she had declared, her earlier suspicions apparently forgotten. The ceremony was to be held under the old oak tree where, as James had recently revealed, he used to play as a boy. Reverend Collins from the Silver Creek Church waited there now, Bible in hand, as guests gathered on chairs arranged in rows before him. Henry knocked on the study door where James waited. "It's time, boss." James took a deep breath and followed his foreman outside. As he took his place beside the Reverend, he scanned the assembled crowd neighbors, ranch hands, townspeople all smiling back at him. It struck him then how isolated he had allowed himself to become after Margaret's death, and how Eleanor had not only brought him back to life, but had reconnected him with his community. A hush fell over the gathering as Eleanor appeared on the porch. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, not the traditional white, as this was a second marriage for James, but she was radiant nonetheless. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the meadow that morning. As she walked toward him, James felt his heart swell with emotions he had never expected to feel again. Love, hope, the promise of a future, shared with someone who understood him completely. When Eleanor reached his side and their hands joined, the Reverend began the ceremony. The words were traditional, but to James and Eleanor, each vow held profound meaning, promises forged through the winter months when they had learned to rely on one another, to trust and support each other through whatever challenges arose. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins finally declared. "You may kiss your bride." As James leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. Eleanor's arms wrapped around his neck, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, a miracle neither had been looking for. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household in attendance. Fiddle music filled the air as people danced on the grass, and children played tag between the adults' legs. As dusk settled over the ranch, Eleanor found herself seated beside Mrs. Holloway, watching James as he spoke animatedly with a group of neighboring ranchers. "You know," Mrs. Holloway said, following Eleanor's gaze, "when you first arrived, I was certain you were a fortune hunter who had somehow ensnared our grieving James." Eleanor turned to her, surprised by the frank admission. "Oh, don't look so shocked, dear," Mrs. Holloway chuckled. "I've never been one to mince words. The point is, I was wrong about you. What you've brought to this community goes beyond just healing James. You've reminded us all what it means to open our hearts to unexpected possibilities." Before Eleanor could respond, James appeared before them, hand extended. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Thornton?" The her new name, sent a thrill through Eleanor as she placed her hand in his. "You may indeed, Mr. Thornton." As James led her to where others were dancing, he pulled her close. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his strength. "When I knocked on your door that day, all I wanted was shelter for the night. I never imagined I'd find a home. A family." James's arms tightened around her. "When I opened that door, I was a man half alive. You brought color back into a world I'd resigned myself to seeing only in shades of gray." They swayed together as the fiddle played a slow, sweet melody. Around them, their friends and neighbors continued the celebration. But in that moment, they were alone together in the perfect understanding of two souls who had found each other against all odds. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the ranch was quiet once more, Eleanor and James stood on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled Montana sky. "I've been thinking," James said, his arm around her waist, "about what you said when you first came here, that you were trying to save enough to reach your aunt in California." Eleanor looked up at him curiously. "What about it? Would you like to write to her, invite her to visit, or even to come live here? There's plenty of room, and no one should be separated from family." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "I would love that, James. She's the only family I have left." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Not anymore," he corrected gently. "You have me now. And Henry and Sarah, and all the others. But most importantly, you have yourself the brave woman who walked up to a stranger's door and offered to clean his house for a place to stay." His blue eyes crinkled with affection. Who could have known that one desperate act would lead to all of this? Eleanor stood on tiptoe to kiss him, her heart full to bursting. Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take. As they walked hand in hand into their home truly theirs now, in every sense, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. From destitution to belonging, from solitude to love, from a temporary arrangement to a lifetime commitment. The lonely rancher and the desperate visitor had saved each other, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the moments of our deepest need.